اليوم التشابتر تبعنا هو عن الكوست استيميشن اند بادجيتنج باول بارت من هيدي السيشن. قبل ما ننتقل للتشابترز 9 10 اللي هن تكمله لبعضهم، اللي هن يخصهم اكثر بالورك بريك داون ستراكشر وكيف نحن بنعمل سكادجول للبروجكت تبعنا بيزد على التاسكس اللي نحن قسمناهم. فيرست كيف نحن بنعمل استيميشن لبادجت تبع بروجكت معين. First, talking about cost estimation. In project management, the cost estimation is the process of forecasting the financial and other resources that are needed to complete a certain project within a certain defined scope. So, the cost estimation accounts for each element required for the project, starting from the material and finishing by the labor. It calculates a rough total amount that determines the project's budget and an initial cost estimation that determine whether an organization green lights a certain project or not based on its estimated initial cost. So, if the project is green lighted and it moves forward, the estimate can be factored in defining the project scope by itself. If the cost estimation comes too high, a certain organization might decide to cut down some parts of the project or remove or decline the project altogether based on what she sees. So basically, if a certain project is over budget, we can cut off some of its part to make it affordable if it still sells without these parts, or else it should be discarded altogether. So as we have said, the rough cost of a certain project includes an estimation for how much the labor will cost us, how much the material for doing this project will cost us, how much the subcontracting, if we are outsourcing things by subcontracting, how much these subcontractors will cost us, the equipment and facilities that we will be either purchasing or leasing are also added. The cost of these things are also added to this estimation, and as well, if some travels are required, let's say for example you are selling a project abroad, if you need to go to do several meetings abroad with the other management, so the cost of travel is also included in the cost of, or in the estimated cost of our project. So these are the common things that are taken into consideration when we want to estimate the cost of a certain project. Now, these costs can be divided into several types. The first type is the direct cost. So direct costs are the costs that are associated with a single area, such as a certain department or the project itself. So as the type of example for direct cost, the labors are considered as direct cost. The purchasing of material is considered a direct cost. Purchase or lease of equipment is considered as a direct cost. Conversely, there are some classified as indirect costs. The indirect costs are those that are incurred by the organization at large, such as utilities and quality control. So these are not direct costs. So if you are making use of some, let's say, public or private utilities that incur some costs, these are indirect costs because they will be shared among several projects probably. If you have, let's say, a quality control department that controls all your product line, and this product will be also controlled by this department, so this is also kind of shared, so it is called an indirect cost for the project. So it's not a cost that enters directly in the cost of your project. You can produce it without paying this cost, but it must be done for quality assurance, for example. So within these two categories, here are some typical elements that a cost estimation will take into account. So هون عم نحكي بالdirect والindirect. First, the labor, as we have already said. So the cost of team members working on the project, both in terms of wages and time. Material and equipment, so the cost of resources required for the project, from physical tools to software to legal permits, etc. The lease of the facilities, so the cost of using and any working space that are not owned by the organization. These are some indirect costs that can occur. So the cost of purchasing things from exterior vendors, such as hiring a third-party vendor or contractor, this is also a cost. Finally, we have the reserves that we put in case we need some further money to mitigate some risks. This is called a contingency plan. So contingency plans are added direct costs for the project. So we must take into consideration if something out of what's expected occurs, we must have enough money to cover it, and this is what we refer to as contingency. Now, going from the direct and indirect costs, we go to the other two types that can be differentiated altogether. So these can be overlapping, by the way. So a direct cost can be recurring and non-recurring. An indirect cost can be recurring or non-recurring. It can be fixed or variable, etc. So now we have listed all the type of costs in this first point, and we will continue to differentiate between different types of them, where they can classify into one or many of these types. So moving from direct versus indirect, we have recurring versus non excuse me, we have recurring versus non-recurring. So the recurring costs are costs that keep regenerating throughout the project. So we will be paying, let's say, on weekly basis or on monthly basis, etc. These are considered recurring costs, such as the wages, for example, of the employees, or the leasing amount for the buildings, etc. Some other costs can be non-recurring, so they are paid only once, such as, for example, if we purchase a certain machine, we pay it only once. And next classification is fixed versus variable. So some costs are fixed, some other are variable. For example, if we take, let's say, the cost of purchasing some materials, this is a fixed cost. Conversely, the wages or the leasing can be variable. So let's say the wage of an employee can be increasing throughout years, so it's a variable cost. The leasing of a certain building can be incremental, so it's also variable. So here we can differentiate between fixed and variable. And finally, normal versus expedited. So normal costs are costs that are directly related to the project, to doing the project, versus the expedited ones are costs that are additional in order to motivate our team, etc. So here, if we want to take two examples, as a normal cost, we have the wage of the employee. As an expedited cost, we have the bonus for the employees. So these are this is a last set of classification. Now this is a certain table that illustrate what we were saying. So if we take, for example, the direct labor, it's a direct cost, it's a recurring cost, it's a fixed cost, it's a normal cost. The building lease, conversely, is an indirect cost, is a recurring cost. Fixed and variable, it depends. So if the lease is fixed via a contract, it can be considered fixed. If it is incremental, it will be considered variable. and it is a certain normal cost. Now the expedite مثل ما قلت لكم هود الاشياء بنستعملهم للتحفيز such as bonuses. It's a direct cost. It's non-recurring. انا مش كل شهر بيجي بعطي تحفيز. هيدا بعطيها كل ما الاقي انه في حاجه انه حفز. الاكسبediشن is variable. انا مش دايما بعطي البونus ذاته. And it is of type expedited rather than normal. Finally, if we take the purchase of material, it is also a direct cost. It is recurring. It is variable. And it falls under the normal class in the last classification. Now, let's continue talking about the cost estimation. So, the cost estimation can be divided based on its accuracy. So, the higher the accuracy is, the better it becomes. The lower the accuracy is, the worse it becomes, because we will be roughly estimating something that might highly change. So let's talk about this different classification for cost estimation. Cost estimation, starting from the least accurate one, which is the ballpark estimate. So a ballpark estimate is a certain rough initial estimate based on high-level client objectives and large margin of uncertainty. This is why it's not so accurate. The deliverables are not clear yet at this stage, so a certain ballpark cost estimation is done at the early stages. ما بيكون بعد صارت الفكرة mature عنه. So this is why it cannot be so specific. So therefore, it's out of necessity. This estimate must be a rough guess. A ballpark estimate should be a price range rather than a fixed fee. So whenever a certain client comes and asks you about a rough estimation for a certain vague project, you cannot give a single amount. You can tell him, let's say, for example, it will cost roughly between $2,000 and $3,000. So it's basically a range when we talk about a ballpark cost estimation. Now, when we go to a certain comparative cost estimation, it's when we go a little bit deeper in our study. بطلنا عم نحكي just concepts بالهوا، بلشنا نحط نقط على الأرض، عم نفوت بأشياء more specific. So we go to the comparative cost estimation by checking or comparing what we will be doing with other things that have things in common with our project. And this is why it's called comparative. So based on such comparison, we can have a certain rough estimation that is accurate up to plus or minus 15%. Next, when we finish our study, so here's the feasibility cost. Here we are at a certain advanced stage. So we have made our feasibility study by taking into consideration all the different aspects that can kick into our project. So here we can make a certain cost estimation that is up to 10% accurate, because we have everything now clear in front of us. So we should not have many hidden things that can change. And finally, the last stage that we reach, it's upon signing the contract, we should fix a certain definitive cost that must not exceed 5% of inaccuracy. So here we have reached the most mature form of our study for the project. We have done the work breakdown structure. We have iterated over the cost of each one of the the sub-tasks, etc. And we have a clear idea about what we have. So our estimation should be roughly correct at this point. Now, what can cause the problems with cost estimation? So, problems with cost estimation can originate from several factors, starting from low initial estimates. So, we tend to fall into this trap. بالاخص بس نكون عم نشتغل مع زبون and I desperately want to take it. So we can fall for the trap of estimating lower than it is actually just to attract the client. So this is one of the problem for the cost estimation. When you tell your client, let's say for example, it will cost around $1,000, and then when you come to the real realization, you see that it costs 1,500 or 2,000. So you should be aware about this. When you are estimating a certain cost, don't fall into this trap. Do not underestimate the initial cost. Another problem that can arise is when we have unexpected technical difficulties that arise during the development of the project. So let's say everything was working okay, and out of nowhere we found that, let's say for example, we want to integrate with another merchant or another product, and here we cannot, or we do not have the capacity of doing this. We have overestimated our capacities. We thought that we could do it, and now we cannot do it. So we have technical difficulties. We need to hire some experts to help us, and this will raise the cost significantly. So unexpected difficulties can cause problems in the cost estimation. Next, an obvious point is the lack of definition. So when we are discussing a certain project, if things are not very well defined, this can definitely lead to wrong cost estimation. We have to define everything very specifically in order to reach a certain correct cost estimation. And another problem is the specification changes. When we make a certain estimation and while developing the project, we have some changes in the requests of the client or in the specification, which drastically can change our costs or our expenses. So this causes another problem in the cost estimation that is done prior to the realization of the project. And finally, we can have some external factors that can affect the cost estimation, such as, for example, political issues, pandemics, etc. So these all can be external factors that are not always predictable, and that should be covered basically by what we have already called the contingency cost. So it's covered by the reserves that we add in excess. So if I estimate the cost of a certain project, let's say at $1,000, usually I don't give this cost for the client. I give, for example, $1,200. I keep $200 for contingency expenses. So if any external factor arises, I can cover it with my contingencies. So as it's becoming more and more obvious, how do we create a certain project budget estimation? So this falls into this illustrated triangle. So the project plan should be broken into work breakdown structure. Then we do the scheduling, and after doing this, we can do the budgeting. So the budget is a certain plan that identifies the resources, the goals, the schedule, and allows the firm to achieve these goals. Why do we have to do all of these? First, if we do not do the WBS, we cannot reach accurate estimations. To reach accurate estimation, we should break our tasks into small tasks that can be accurately predicted. Next, we should do our scheduling carefully, because the scheduling will show us the recurring cost of our project. So we have wages for the employees, we have leasing contracts with the contractors, etc. So we should know for how long we will be paying these recurrent costs. So this is why this set of things come all together in order to do a certain project budgeting. So we can work either top down or bottom up or activity based. So top down is when we start with a rough estimate for all the project, and then we start breaking it into smaller things or smaller sub costs. The bottom up is when we start with the smaller task and we start building up until we reach the whole project. So the bottom up is more accurate basically. And we can do a certain budgeting based on activity based costing or ABC. So this is when we go to a certain plan that is more or less pay as you go. So قد ما بيدفع لنا بنشتغل بالتاسك، سو بنمشي معه على قد الدفع. سو هون ببطل في عندنا سكادجول واضح when we go activity based. So the work breakdown structure is the basis for any project budget or cost estimate, as we have said. The WBS consists of all the tasks necessary in creating the completed product that we want to deliver. It decomposes the process required to produce the defined deliverables. So when we do this decomposition, we can go for a bottom-up project budgeting, which will be a better estimation than going for a top-down one. Now let's elaborate further about the ABC strategy or the activity-based costing. A certain activity-based costing, referred as ABC as we have already seen, is a method of assigning overhead and indirect costs such as salaries and utilities to products and services. The activity-based cost system takes into account, or costs accounting is based on activities which are considered any event or any unit of work that is related to our project or that is required to reach a certain specific goal. A certain activity can be a cost driver, such as orders of machines, setup of machines, etc. So the cost driver rate, which is the cost pool total divided by the cost driver, is used to calculate the amount of overhead and indirect costs related to a particular activity. So now, after assigning the costs and identifying this cost driver, now we can then compute a certain cost rate per cost driver. We multiply the cost driver by the rate times the volume and of the cost driver, and we reach finally the activity cost, and we keep adding up the cost of the activities until we finish our project. So هون هيدا بالاجمال مثل ما قلت لكم هيدا it's kind of pay as you go. So انا بسلم كل تاسك او كل شقفه لحالها بالاكتيفيتي بيست كوستنج، وكل شيء كلفيات بصيروا على هاد التاسك هن بدخلهم ضمن هيدا الاكتيفيتي بيست كوستنج شو ما كانوا يكونوا. So this is the calculation that takes process in this activity based costing. Now to conclude this chapter, let's retake the budget contingencies. هاي مثل ما قلت لكم هاي الملاءة الزيادة الريزيرف اللي بنكون حاطينها حدنا. So the budget contingencies or making contingencies is the allocation of extra fund to cover uncertainties and improve the chance of finishing on time. So أنا بكون شايل funds على جنب تغطي الأشياء اللي معقول يطلعوا لي بقوسة يطلعوا لي فجأة. So أنا ساعة اللي بكون مغطيهم هودي بيكون عندي تشانس أعلى إنه أخلص على الوقت وما يصير عندي مشاكل. Example, a set of examples. Why do we need these contingencies? So first we need contingency because the project scope may change. It's unlikely, but it can happen. So sometimes we start a project going towards a certain scope and the client decides to deviate from the scope throughout the project. So to cover additional costs for this deviation, we need the contingencies. Murphy's law is present. What is Murphy's law? حدا منكم يعرف؟ جيب لشوف. Anyone heard about Murphy's law? راح اعطيكم اياها شو هي. Murphy's law بكل بساطة أنا بس كون عم بعمل estimation there is a possibility that some things go wrong. So شو بيجي بيقول لي ميرفي؟ بيقول لي أنت عم تحسب الكوست تبعك if something can go wrong حسب إنه هو it will go wrong. يعني خد ال worst case scenarios دايما بالحسابات تبعك. So whenever you find something that can go wrong consider that it will go wrong. If you do this you will be covering or you will be doing a certain contingencies that can cover almost everything that can go wrong in your project, leading finally to enough money to cover anything that goes wrong. This is Murphy's law. Next, we need the contingency because the cost estimation must anticipate interaction costs. And finally, normal conditions are rarely encountered. We basically always pass through some unusual conditions or some problems. So the best case scenario, which are the normal conditions, are rarely encountered throughout a complete project. هون بنرجع على خبرية ميرفيز لو. هلا هون اكيد مش عم نكون هالقد متشائمين، مش عم نقول انه كل شيء رح يصير عكس ما نحن بدنا، بس انه مش عم يكون كمان كثير متفائلين. اذا عندي احتمال مشاكل it is rare انه ما يصير معي مشاكل بالمره. So this is why we need budget contingencies. هيدي جايز اول بارت من السيشن تبعنا اليوم بتكون انتهت مع الشابتر 8. رح ناخذ بريك صغير 10 minutes let's say لل9 الا ربع وبنرجع بنبلش بالشابتر 9.